Good evening. I'm Julie James, Vice President of the Filson Historical Society, and we really appreciate you joining us here tonight. Thank you for joining us for Lexington, the extraordinary life and turbulent times of America's legendary racehorse. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to remind everyone to please take out your phones and make sure they're on silent for the duration of the program. We will have a Q&A session after the conclusion of the program. We do ask for you to use one of our microphones when you ask your question, because we have people that are joining us via Zoom and we want everyone to hear what the questions being asked. If you are joining us virtually, feel free to chat in your questions and a Filson representative will relay those to the presenter as time permits. Kim Wickens grew up in Dallas, Texas, and practiced a criminal defense lawyer in New Mexico for 20 years. She subsequently turned her attention to writing, which she studied at Kenyon College, and has devoted the last several years to researching this book. Wickens' work has appeared in the Washington Post, Narrative Magazine, The Blood Horse, and Pollock Report. Please join me in welcoming Kim Wickens.
Wow. Hi, thank you for coming. This is quite a group. I was here actually last Friday and at the opening of the Driftwood Life of Harlan Hubbard exhibit that's was put together by Jessica Whitehead. And she has a book coming out in February about Harlan Hubbard. So I would encourage you to look forward to that. I know that she's also going to be doing a talk here. And if you haven't had a chance to check out that exhibit, I would encourage you to do that as well, because it's a wonderful exhibit. This is a very special night for me because this is my last speaking engagement on Lexington. This horse has been in my life for like 10 or 11 years. He's been in my life for a very long time. And I have done quite a few speaking engagements since the book came out in its original hardback form in July 2023, and this is the very last one. And so it means so much to me that you're here. I thank the Filson Historical Society for inviting me to be here and to present this. And I did research here at Filson on Jerome Clark's Sue Mundy. And so it really is full circle. You're very special to be able to end it here, so to speak, at this very special place, very special museum, very special research facility that has wonderful collections. And so it means so much to me. Thank you again, Filson, for allowing me to be here and talk to you guys. So there's so much to talk about this, wonderful, phenomenal horse. And I'm just going to give you just kind of a breakdown, a little synopsis, so to speak, about Lexington and let you know about him in case there's anyone who doesn't. Lexington was a thoroughbred racehorse who raced in pre-Civil War times, antebellum period. He was foaled in 1850 in Lexington, Kentucky, bred by Dr. Elisha Warfield, out of Alice Carnell, who was a very cantankerous, very agitated mare all the time. She was very difficult. And that was his wonderful mare that he bred to the phenomenal racehorse Boston, who was the horse of the time. He was the racehorse, the sire of the time. Everybody wanted a Boston. And so Dr. Warfield breeds Alice Carnell to Boston. The result is this foal named Darley. He names him Darley because he resembles the Darley Arabian out of England, one of the 3 foundational sires of the thoroughbred out of Great Britain. The horse resembles Darley. He names him Darley. And then, to make a long story short, the horse becomes such a phenomenal, and he's built to run, this horse. I mean, he has such a broad backbone. I mean, you can just imagine what kind of a heart, what kind of a lung, what kind of a running capacity must have been inside, this horse. The backbone was unusually large, they say. Had a very wide jawbone, his legs were not really what we would look for in conformation, but they were designed in such a way he would make a great dressage horse, actually, because he had an incredible underreach and was able to just propel himself and never tire, and could run in any surface, mud, you name it. He was not challenged by any of it. And he becomes this, you know, horse that's built to run, this phenomenal horse, and is eventually purchased from Dr. Warfield by a man by the name of Richard Ten Broeck, who is very special to Louisville. Hopefully we can get into that later. Richard Ten Broeck is this turf man from Albany who owns the Metairie Racecourse in New Orleans, which at that time was the mecca of horse racing, not here in Kentucky, not in Louisville, not in Lexington, not in Saratoga, which didn't even exist back then. None of that was on the radar at that time. And so it was all in New Orleans at the Metairie. And so he comes looking for a horse to represent the state of Kentucky, because at this race course of his, Richard Ten Broeck's, he has put together this race called the Great State Post Stakes. And he's got, you know, a few states that have entered horses, and he wants to have these states compete against each other with the very best horse from their state. But Kentucky is aloof and will not commit whatsoever to participating at all in this phenomenal race that's supposed to take place in New Orleans. And so Richard Ten Broeck comes to the Association Racecourse in Lexington, and that is where he sees Darley run his maiden in such a way that blows his mind. I mean, he knows right then and there, this is one heck of a horse. Back then, in that era, they did not run these simple furlong races. I call them simple because you'll understand. They did not run these, you know, 1.25 miles, these simple little 1.5 miles Belmont Stakes that they do in New York. That was nothing to these horses. What they ran back then was a system called heat racing. And these heat races could be anywhere from a mile heat all the way up to a 4-mile heat race. The 4-mile heat races would be your grade 1 type of race today, your upper echelon of racing. And so if it was a 4-mile heat, the horses would run 4 miles around an oval track. They would take a 45-minute cooling down period. Some of them were not able to go back out to compete, but whoever was able to go back out to compete after the 45 minutes would then go compete again. They would run another 4 miles. And this could go on and on. They could run 20 miles. This could go on and on until you had at least one horse win 2 heats. And so it took a very, very strong horse, a horse with stamina, a horse with courage to be able to run that type of racing. And that's how it was. That's how it was all done in the United States back then in the 19th century. And earlier, that's actually how it started in Great Britain. The King's Plates were 4-mile races. And so that kind of trickled down into how we started doing things here in the United States. And so he buys this horse to compete and brings him to New Orleans. He changes his name from Darley to Lexington because Richard Ten Broeck is he's a racehorse promoter. He's a race course promoter. He is the guy that makes things happen. He is the guy that advertises things and gets everyone interested in events and gets everyone to his race course at the Metairie so they will pay the money to get into the gates and so forth. And he has to stage these fantastic productions. And so that's what he does. And he cannot have a horse by the name of Darley representing the state of Kentucky in the Great State Post Stakes. He has to be named something like Lexington. And so that's how Lexington's name comes about. Lexington eventually races 7 races, is retired. I mean, it's not a lot of races back then. I mean, Boston, his sire, ran 45 races at heats, almost all of them 4-mile heats. He was retired after 7 races because he had a worsening vision that was likely brought on because of a binging incident where he overate like a keg of corn, and then he was exercised the next day, and when I talked to Dr. Claire Latimer of Root and Riddle, she's the equine ophthalmologist, she said it's very likely, because that's what they thought in the era is what might have started his blindness, is that he ate and then was raced the next day. It could have lodged something basically into the bloodstream. Normally we would see this as laminitis, perhaps, but it could have affected his vision. And what he probably had was equine recurring uveitis that then started to impact. He was totally blind after the first incident in the right eye, and then starts to lose vision in the left eye. And because that vision kept coming and going and coming and going, he was no longer reliable as a racehorse. He was retired by Richard Ten Broeck after 7 races, during which one of those races, he broke the world speed record for 4-mile speed that had been set by a horse named Matcham in Great Britain that had stood for 100 years before Lexington came along and broke that record. And so he was quite a runner, quite a phenomenal racehorse. Retires with all of these accolades, having pulled together, this is antebellum period in New Orleans, having pulled together the nation for these races that he was running in. I mean, we already had, great divisions going on at that time. You had, the Underground Railroad was going on, the Fugitive Slave Act. You had all of this great division within the country already, but he was able to pull people together from North and South. North and South rooted for this horse. They wanted this horse to do well. And so it was phenomenal, really, that he was able to do that in this era. Is eventually retired and sold to a man by the name of Robert Alexander, who was born in Kentucky, but then moves to England and Scotland and takes over the family business in Scotland, becomes a British subject so that he can inherit the family business of Airdrie Ironworks. And his love, though, his passion is in Kentucky, and he had always endeavored to do something with this family farm that he had named Woodburn Farm in Midway, Kentucky. And his father was not interested. His father, by the way, having worked as a secretary, as a scribe for Benjamin Franklin in Paris, but his father had no interest whatsoever in being a farmer or doing any of that type of thing. He was on the bank board in Frankfurt and, various things. And so eventually, after his father passes, Alexander moves back to the Midway area, buys the farm out from his siblings. It's Woodburn Farm. He then sets out with this goal to breed thoroughbred horses and to breed the thoroughbred horse on a system, on a scale, because this had not happened yet in America. In England, and he saw this there, the horse was being bred for purpose. The horse was being bred very systematically. There were great detailed records kept about pedigrees, and we're going to match this sire to this mare to bring out this, certain performance that we want the horse to have. And you had individual breeders in America that were dabbling in these things, but it was never done so systematically like that. And it was never recorded so systematically like that. And it was never done with the purpose of selling the product or the horse to the public. And so he wanted to accomplish that. He wanted to do that. And he set out and in 2 years trained himself to do this. And by visiting all the stud farms in England and so forth, comes back and he needs a stallion. He wants a marquee stallion, some horse that's really going to draw the public to him at Woodburn Farm. And so he finds Richard Ten Broeck, who is then in England racing horses, the first American to race American bred horses in England. He finds him there at Goodwood, the race course, and says, that horse Lexington, is he for sale? And Richard Ten Broeck says, no, I'm not interested in selling him, but if I was going to sell him, I would sell him to you for $15,000, which back then no one had ever paid. Like right now, we cannot imagine such a thing, right? With $15,000, that's ridiculously low for a thoroughbred. But back then, no one had paid that kind of amount. Alexander walks away. He says, thank you for your time. I'm not interested, walks away. His friend that accompanies him says, you cannot leave behind the best racehorse in the world. You have to go back and talk to this Richard Ten Broeck and buy the horse. Not even negotiate, just buy it. And so he does. He goes, he buys Lexington, who was standing at another farm in Kentucky at the time. And so Lexington then comes on board at Woodburn Farm and becomes the foundation sire, or a very significant one, a very significant foundation sire of the American Thoroughbred. No horse really has matched, he was 16 times the leading sire. No horse has matched that. You would be hard pressed to look into the pedigree of any horse running today and trace it back and not find a cross of Lexington somewhere in there. Justify, our most recent Triple Crown winner, is traces to him by the 8th dam. I mean, so you have this tail female trace all the way to the 8th dam right into Lexington. And so he really does, come up into the pedigrees of just pretty much every horse that's running today. This almost did not happen. And now we get to where I ended up at the Filson Historical Society. When I was researching this book, there was nothing written about Lexington. There were some things, of course, that were written in the 19th century. There were some various articles that existed here and there, but there was no comprehensive biography about Lexington. And so it was very much trying to piece together his story and the story of the people that were involved in his life. And for me, I wanted to use primary sources, because when you have the primary source, you're holding the document that existed back then, that was held by Alexander, that was held by Richard Ten Broeck, letters between the two. And it's just kind of, for me, that special touch, like you're actually touching the actual history. But in the primary source, the historian or the author, or whoever is interpreting the document, can interpret it the way that they would want to, and the way that they feel that they need to interpret that. Whereas if you're looking through a secondary source, you're limited by that historian's review of the primary document. And so maybe that historian didn't see something that might have been important in your analysis if you had been able to read the primary source. Sometimes all we have is the secondary source, and that's all you have to go with. But wherever I could find primary source material, that's where I went. And so it came, putting the story together came all over, traveling to various places, Saratoga, New Orleans, Virginia, all over Kentucky, various historical societies, looking at letters that were written, looking at the war documents that were out of the war records that were kept by the Union and the Confederacy, and also coming to the Filson, because when I started looking at what was happening on Woodburn Farm during the Civil War, where Lexington was standing as sire, Woodburn Farm had been raided multiple times, 3 times actually, by Confederate guerrillas. And they were after these racehorses. And as you can imagine, in the Civil War times, I mean, if you had a fast and courageous horse, that could be more valuable to you than a Navy Colt revolver, right? Because this horse is going to run you out of the fray and protect you. And they were constantly looking to replenish their horses. I mean, these horses were their mode of transportation. They would wear down, they would break down, they needed new horses. Where better to go than thoroughbred racing farms, especially Woodburn Farm, who at this point has acquired this reputation of breeding phenomenal Lexington colts. And so the farm is raided on 3 separate occasions, and at least 2 of them were most likely at the hands of Jerome Marcellus Clark, who had been named Sue Mundy. And when I read about Sue Mundy, and I read about him in, it was some kind of a journal, that Allison Younger, who used to write for the Louisville Daily Journal, had written about Sue Mundy. And when I read about Sue Mundy, I was so fascinated that I had to research this guy myself. And so looking up very quickly, I realized that the Filson Historical Society has a very large collection on Marcellus Jerome Clark, Sue Mundy. I came here, I researched him, and boy, was that fascinating. Marcellus Jerome Clark was a young Confederate guerrilla, had served in the Orphan Brigade, and then was under the 2nd Kentucky Cavalry with John Hunt Morgan. When the Morgan's cavalry busts up, basically when Morgan is killed, he sticks around in Kentucky and he forms his own guerrilla squad. And the thing about Jerome Marcellus Clark, 19 years old, was that he was so beautiful in the face, had this long brown hair that he kept loose that hung around his shoulders in curls, and had, you know, a boyish appearance almost, no beard, no mustache, you know, nothing like that. Apparently, according to some of the things that were written about him, had a voice that could be somewhat effeminate and had a way of presenting himself that could be somewhat effeminate as well. And he would dress in women's clothing. And so he had this blue dress that he would wear to various places when he wasn't wearing his Confederate attire. And he was quite the gunslinger, right? So the gunslinger in a dress, a blue dress, running around all over the place, you know, causing havoc all over Kentucky during the Civil War, was always in pursuit of a fast horse, always. That was always what he wanted, was a fast horse. Sue Mundy, the name comes about because during his raid of a stagecoach on the Harrodsburg Road, the witnesses to this describe this person who they're not quite sure whether it's a female or a male. They call this person Lieutenant Flowers. They're not sure what this, you know, what is this person? And so George Prentice, the editor of the Louisville Daily Journal then, is very upset with President Lincoln because the man that he has put in charge to watchdog over Kentucky is not doing a very good job. And General Burbridge, you know, was committing a lot of atrocities, basically, you know, under the guise of the Union. And all of this roughshod guerrilla factions were running all over the place and raiding farms and robbing people and so forth. And he really wanted to get the attention of President Lincoln. And he wanted, the ultimate goal was to change out the Union Guard in Kentucky. And so when he discovers this beautiful individual that had raided the stagecoach on the Harrodsburg Road, he decides that this person should be named Sue Mundy, which is most likely a name that Prentice borrowed from a prostitute's arrest record, this burly type of prostitute, you know, who was kind of, you know, violent, you know, and so forth, borrows the name and says now that we have this guerrilla by the name of a she-devil, a woman guerrilla by the name of Sue Mundy that is running around doing all of this. And so he basically interjects Sue Mundy into almost all of these things, you know, in the Daily Journal. I mean, and I went, you know, here, also the Louisville Public Library, and was looking through the daily journals. And during this time period, it's everywhere. It's Sue Mundy this, Sue Mundy has done this, Sue Mundy has robbed the Masonic Hall. You know, she, you know, has done all of these horrible things. And in this process, you also have the competing paper, the Louisville Daily Democrat, who is, of course, saying Sue Mundy is not a woman, Sue Mundy is a man, you know. So you have these competing, you know, newspapers that are arguing over the identity and you know, so forth of this Sue Mundy character that is running around doing all of these heinous crimes. But Sue Mundy, Jerome Clark, does go to Woodburn on one occasion and steals the horse Asteroid. And there have been some photos up here of Asteroid. And in the photo, or in the image of the painting by Edward Troy that's titled The Undefeated Asteroid, you can see in the background of that photo, when it comes up again, someone tell me, you can see in the background of that photo, the gorillas in the background on horseback with their pistols riding toward Asteroid. And so Edward Troy, the famous equine painter, was in the process of painting Asteroid when he was stolen by Sue Mundy from Woodburn Farm. And then eventually he is reclaimed and brought back to Woodburn Farm. But Edward Troy supposedly was so angry about this that he could not complete his painting on time, you know, that he puts the whole scene in the background when he completes the painting of the gorillas coming to steal Asteroid. And this goes on, you know, at least, you know, one more time, you know, Alexander, the owner of Woodburn Farm, puts up, you know, a request, a bounty, $500 reward for the capture of Sue Mundy. He puts up $1,000 reward for the return of Asteroid. And then, of course, after everything he does at that point to try to protect his farm, it's raided again by the guerrillas. And this time he loses quite a few racehorses, most of which were not recovered, 15 racehorses. Lexington that night, according to Alexander, who wrote about that particular night, this is the third raid, in great detail, Alexander writes about what happened. And at that point, what we know now, or what we suspect, is that it was Sue Mundy and William Quantrell, because those were the people identified as committing a raid at Midway, the Midway Depot, the same night that's 2 miles away from Woodburn Farm. And then they were headed to Woodburn Farm after that. They stole 15 racehorses. Lexington most likely was hidden. We know, according to Alexander, that he was very concerned about the safety of Lexington, runs over to Lexington stable, directs the stable individuals there to go hide the best racehorses, and then that's all we know. But we can surmise that he and Lexington were most likely in the woods for the remainder of the night, because no one saw them, either one of them, after that, until the next morning. So another individual, and then Lexington, it's, when I was researching, I mean, he's everywhere. He's on the top of the Woodlawn Vase. So when Alexander wanted to commemorate Lexington and Woodburn Farm, he hired Tiffany's and Company, commissioned them to create this vase for the Woodlawn Racecourse. Woodburn Farm is actually the scene at the bottom of the Woodlawn Vase, and Lexington is the horse that's on the top of the Woodlawn Vase. And that's, of course, the vase that's given to the Preakness winner every year, Preakness being a son of Lexington. And so Lexington sires, you know, all of these phenomenal racehorses, including Cincinnati, who is the war horse of General Grant. I mean, he's just everywhere, you know, he trickles everywhere into history during that period of time. One of the individuals that was very key to Lexington's life, obviously, we talked about him a little bit before, is Richard Ten Broeck. And Richard Ten Broeck was this man from Albany who becomes this great promoter of racehorses, eventually ends up in England, and then after racing on and off in England for about 20 years, finds his way back in Louisville and marries an individual by the name of Patty Anderson, actually meets her in England, marries her in England, and comes back to Louisville. They buy this estate on the outskirts of Louisville, and she names it Hurstbourne. And she names it Hurstbourne after the estate that was owned by the Duke and Duchess of Portland in England, who were friends of theirs. And the home then eventually becomes, as what we know it today, Hurstbourne Country Club. And of course, the Hurstbourne community, you know, out there, I think there's Lexington Street, there's a Darley Street, I believe. There's a Ten Broeck Street. All of these are intertwined, of course, with the estate that he owned. Richard Ten Broeck was another very interesting individual. And this is stuff I'm going to tell you now that is not in the book, because it's not, you know, keeping the story central to Lexington and following that horse's life. This part diverges from Lexington. And so it's interesting information about Richard Ten Broeck that's not in the book. And when Richard Ten Broeck moved back here with Patty to Louisville, they were happily married. They stayed married for many years. There were no children of the marriage, but eventually she dies of cancer. This is the love of his life. He's very grieved over the death of Patty. She's buried at Cave Hill. He then goes on to a train to attend to some family matters in downtown Louisville. And he ends up sitting next to a family member of Patty's on the train by the name of Whitaker. And Whitaker, unfortunately, was a guy that was not mentally sound and had committed murders in the past. Whatever possessed Richard Ten Broeck, who was usually a very quiet, reserved man, to engage with Whitaker, I don't know, but they did. They started engaging in an argument. Richard Ten Broeck gets off the train at the next station, tries to evade this Whitaker. He says, I leave me alone, just leave me alone. Whitaker follows him off the train. An altercation occurs on the platform, and Whitaker shoots Richard Ten Broeck 4 times. 4 times. Misses 3 of the shots, but hits him on the 4th one, aims the pistol at his head, pulls the trigger, and down Richard Ten Broeck falls. There's a pool of blood around his head. They pick him up, they take him to a bar. They call a doctor in. Someone goes to tell the Louisville Daily Journal that Richard Ten Broeck, the famous turfman, is dead. And so a doctor comes, he starts examining, the wound, figures out that it was not fatal, that basically the bullet has entered, but it has traveled over his skull and out the back, and it never penetrated the skull. And so, like, about, I don't know, some period of time later, Richard Ten Broeck awakens there in the bar, smokes a cigar because he's famous for cigar smoking. I mean, the man used to race horses in England. He would ride his own horses in gentleman matches, and he would smoke a cigar the entire time. The cigar would never leave his mouth. And, smokes the cigar. His friends, collect him. They take him back to Hurstbourne Mansion. He survives this miraculous shooting, and then goes on to continue racing in England, and so forth. Eventually, he marries another woman, I think maybe only 2 years after Patty died. Marries another woman who is 40 years his junior, by the name of Mary Newcomb. And it was not a good marriage, as you can imagine, with such a diverse age. It was a marriage plagued by distrust and arguments and so forth. So he is eventually abandoned by Mary, but he did have a son with Mary. He chases the racing scene that is now going on in California, chases the racing scene to California, ends up there in San Mateo, right outside of San Francisco, and he no longer is racing in England, but loves races so much, loves racehorses so much. He buys 5 racehorses. He intends to race them, but never does. He's a very aged man at this point, in his 90s or so, and basically just sits on the porch of his, veranda out there in his San Mateo farm, which he named the Hermitage after Andrew Jackson's Hermitage, and sits there and basically just kind of lives his days out there. And one of the things that had always followed Richard Ten Broeck wherever he was, he's a very nomadic type of guy, were his racing trophies. So you can imagine the trophies that he accumulated with Lexington, the trophies that he won when he won the Goodwood Cup with Stark in England, won the Caesar Witch with Prioress, won so many races in England. All of these trophies, they lived with him. He would take them to Hurstbourne. They went everywhere with them, and he still had them in San Mateo, and was very in need of funds, because in that time of his life, had lost pretty much the wealth that he had made, the wealth that allowed him to acquire such a place as Hurstbourne. Was pretty much destitute. And the rumor is that he was writing turf opinions for the San Francisco Call. I could not find any. If they had his name, nothing had his name, in terms of authorship. except for his biography that he wrote about himself for the San Francisco Call. But nothing about turf records or anything authored by him. And supposedly he does this to earn money. We do know that at some point he is seen in San Francisco next to the Palace Hotel. He's on the street there, and he has 2 books that he has scribbled notes about how to race horses. And he is trying to like offer these books to anyone and everyone that passes him on the street, you know, $10, just $10, you know, no one, you know, they don't know who he is. They just think he's a lunatic. They pass by him and no one buys these books, you know, that he's trying to sell for $10. And eventually another turf writer sees him and goes and buys the books. So the story goes, and buys the books from him, and tears well up in his eyes, and he walks away. And it's about a month later after that incident that he walks into a appraiser store in San Francisco and arranges with the appraiser to come inventory his collection of trophies. And he intends to sell these and hopefully gain enough money to live the remainder of his days. And so the story goes, the appraiser goes out to the Hermitage, you know, Richard Ten Broeck's 5-acre little estate. And he sees the door partially open, and he sees the chair on the veranda that Richard Ten Broeck sits in. And he was always a very neat man in his appearance, his whole life. Everything, this is not the guy that's in clothes that are, you know, not ironed or, you know, whatever. It's everything is just perfect, his whole life, the way he dresses himself. And his coat has been very neatly folded and laid across the arm of the chair. But there is no Richard Ten Broeck. And so the appraiser knocks on the door and does not hear a response. And the door is partly open. So he goes inside and he finds the turfman dead. And so you can imagine, he is buried here in Cave Hill. His body was brought back to Cave Hill and buried here. You can imagine what must have been going through him. I mean, to have these trophies, I'm not going to say he died of heartbreak over these trophies, but I mean, it's interesting in a lot of ways, you know, that here he is at the very end of his life. He's about to relinquish the trophies that have been with him his whole life. His whole life, you know, is basically symbolized in those trophies, and dies that day that the appraiser comes. I don't know where the trophies are, and there was never any information about what did happen to the trophies, whether the appraiser took the trophies. I don't know, you know, but that's the story of Richard Ten Broeck, very prosperous man at one point who then loses everything. So tragic, but quite a phenomenal individual himself in what he accomplished for horse racing, what he accomplished in Great Britain, and also, of course, for the wonderful Lexington, because it was Richard Ten Broeck who showcased that horse and showed the world what that horse could really do. I didn't think I would be able to say all that in this amount of time. I have spoke for an hour and a half before. So is there anything anyone would like to ask? I can read something too, but I'd rather ask questions or answer questions.
We can do Q&A. If you have a question, you raise your hand. I'll bring the microphone to you.
Okay, so I have no personal knowledge of what a Turkish bath
Oh my
is or how it works. But what is an equine Turkish bath?
Okay, so the equine Turkish bath, and there was this great article that talked about Hurstbourne and the stables that he built next to Hurstbourne, and that he had an equine Turkish bath, which apparently was popular in England. And so I looked up in the Turbulent Farm, which was one of the periodicals of the time, and they talked about a human Turkish bath, and boy, was that elaborate. It's like going to the spa, right? You know, where all of these fantastic steam and everything was kind of like circulating around you, and they would wrap you up in like a spa, you know, they'd wrap you up in towels and, like kind of cleanse the the pores, and so, all of that. And so the equine Turkish bath, as best I can guess, is something like that, where there was some kind of a mechanism, a steam mechanism or something set up, for the horses. They were very much into, and this is in the book, they would exercise these horses wearing these heavy flannel blankets, and they would, they were not exercised like they are today, where they're just out there like running, They were running in heavy flannel blankets, and the idea was to promote circulation, right? To like, cleanse the body and have them sweat and get out impurities and so forth. And they would exercise them in this type of a way. So I am guessing the equine Turkish bath had some kind of properties like that, that mimicked the whole wrapping of the body that they could then accomplish in the stables instead of out there, on the track, so to speak. But I mean, elaborate, right? Elaborate, quite elaborate for something back then in the 1800s.
What were a couple of the most surprising or interesting pieces of research that you uncovered?
Well, Sue Mundy was one of them, I wasn't expecting that whole story when I started looking into him. So that was definitely something that was interesting. But, for me, it was really just kind of, I wanted to know everything, right? And so I wanted to know how horses traveled back then. I wanted to know what was it like for a war horse, and what was the life like for these horses. And so I guess just immersing myself into that world, reading all of the material from that time, the theater, the fashions, and I think, even though that doesn't come out in words on a page, I think the readers can sense that, or readers can feel when the author knows what they're talking about, or has immersed themselves in that kind of world. It just comes out somehow, even if it's not actual words, but I guess just in terms of surprising, I mean, I knew pretty much, the whole idea of the 4-mile heat racing, which is shocking, when you first hear about it, but I would say just really just living in the world was a pleasure. It wasn't so shocking, so to speak, but it was just a pleasure to go back into that world and kind of be in it. There was a lot of times I didn't want to leave it. I loved being in that little 19th century world. It's not really a great answer, but
Yeah, I'm curious if we know if Lexington ran on turf or dirt tracks, and at what age the horse would have run those grueling races.
he ran on dirt. And the tracks back then were dirt. In fact, he was considered a mud horse because a lot of the races that he ran were in, 8 inches of mud. When he ran the Great State, that was 8 inches of mud that he ran through. And very tiring. His first race, his maiden, was run through mud. Was also, he ran when he broke time, the time record, ran on a very fast track, almost too fast, right? Because it was very hard. New Orleans did not, which was very springy type track because of all the rainfall that they'd normally had been in a drought. And I checked the weather records, for back then. And they had been in a rare form of drought, like that had lasted for weeks. And so it was very dry. The turf was not springy. The turf was very firm, to the point that when he ran that race against time, he lost one shoe. One shoe fell off entirely. The other shoe was broken in half, and his hind plates were bent out of true. It was very, very hot, right? Ran so fast. It was very hot. The ground was so hard. He ran as a 3-year-old, was when he first started running. They did run them at 2, but he was a little slow to mature, and they didn't run him until 3. Part of that was because Dr. Warfield was very aged and hired the services, actually leased the horse to Harry Lewis, one of the paintings has Harry Lewis, who was a freed black man. And Harry Lewis had trained, some, really good racehorses in Kentucky, Richard Singleton, Gray Eagle. And Harry Lewis is the guy who essentially took over the initial training of Darley or Lexington early on and prepared him for those first races. Was there another part of the question?
Here's a question for one of our online participants. Tell us more about the discovery and recovery of Lexington's skeleton and its return to Kentucky.
Lexington, thank you for asking that question. Lexington died in 1875. He was buried at Woodburn Farm. And the love of this horse across the nation was so immense. His death was in the New York Times. It was everywhere when this horse died. And a lot of entities had reached out to, Robert Alexander had passed away at this point, but AJ, his brother, still owned Woodburn Farm and therefore owned Lexington when he passed away. AJ eventually agrees with the Smithsonian Institute to donate Lexington's skeleton to the Smithsonian. It was the Smithsonian who reached out to AJ, and they are the ones who wanted the horse that they were then going to prepare and have displayed at the Centennial in Philadelphia. And H.A. Ward is the individual that they had engaged to do this. H.A. Ward, of course, had eventually, or later on, prepared P.T. Barnum's Jumbo the Elephant. H.A. Ward was on the board of the Smithsonian and was a preparer of skeletons and so forth. Our AJ agrees to donate the skeleton. H.A. Ward comes to Lexington or to the, Midway area, exhumes the horse. We don't know how much of the skeleton had flesh at that point, but he goes through this elaborate process. He takes him back to Rochester, New York, which is where his facility was, goes through this elaborate process of degreasing the bones. First, he has to disassemble the horse, right? He disassembles the horse. And there's a very detailed process for all of this. Has to label every single bone, has to sit in vats of hot water, and the water has to be changed out every 2 days, or the water is going to turn black, and it could turn the skeleton black, and so there's this elaborate process of degreasing the bones and putting the horse's bones basically through what's called maceration. Once the bones are cleaned, he was then put back together by H.A. Ward and displayed. Of course, the Smithsonian owned him at that point. He ends up at the Smithsonian after the Philadelphia Centennial, eventually finds his way up into an attic after exhibits are, exchanged, and they then focus on the Sea of the Life exhibit and what have you, and they move Lexington into the attic out of Bone Hall. And it causes an uproar because no one knows where this horse is, and several people go looking for him. They find him in the attic. He eventually, long story short, makes his way back to the Kentucky Horse Park. This takes about 20 years, actually longer than that. Gerald Strang went looking for him in the 1970, and is the first one to find him up in the attic. So he eventually was brought back to Lexington in 2010 to the Kentucky Horse Park, and that's where he stands today. And so if you're in Lexington and you go to the horse park or make a special trip to the horse park, you will see him there. They do have some construction going on there, but they have made very sure not to have any construction areas around Lexington's bones. So you can't see him. You can see him there, and it's really phenomenal to see. Still owned by the Smithsonian, on loan to the horse park.
I have a three-part question. What made you leave the law behind for a career as a writer?
Crazy, yeah.
And what drew you to Lexington as the topic of your first book? This is your first book?
First book, debut book, yeah.
And what's your next project?
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, it's crazy. And so I wouldn't advise anyone to do it, but, it was something that I was, when I first read about him, I didn't know anything about Lexington, and it just kind of started with, there I was in Albuquerque, New Mexico, practicing law. I've been practicing law for many years, had my own law practice. I'm the person that is the one running it and doing all the work. And would take my vacations and started coming to Lexington, to the Keeneland Library and various other places, New York, New Orleans, and so forth, to do the research. And it was something that I can't even explain it, because I just felt compelled to do it. I mean, it's the weirdest feeling ever, but I felt like I had to do it, and it's so strange, I know, and my friends at the time thought I had just lost it completely. What are you doing? You're going to leave your law practice and write about this. But I did. I left my law practice and devoted all my time to writing it. And I had actually written the entire manuscript, which you don't have to do for nonfiction. This is not fiction, by the way. It's written in a narrative form. You don't have to write the whole manuscript, but I did, and I wrote the thing, sent it off to, picked a couple agents, sent it off, got lucky, got the agent got the publisher, and that's how, that went down. I'm working on a book proposal, not a manuscript, a book proposal now for something else that is not horses. So it'll be a micro history of something very exciting, I think, but not horses. Did that for 10 years.
You might have mentioned this already, but how old was Lexington when he died?
He was 25,
So what year would that have been?
75,
1875?
Yeah.
Okay.
1875.
Okay, here's another online question. Geraldine Brooks' Horse, a fictional account of Lexington, came out within just a couple of months of your book. Were you aware of this very different but similarly themed book? Did the two of you have any exchanges or correspondence, or were you just surprised?
I'm glad that question was asked too. I was talking about it a little bit before with some people. If you have not read Horse, I would encourage that you do so. It's a great book, and it is also about Lexington. And Geraldine's book is a historical fiction of Lexington. This is a narrative nonfiction of Lexington. And what was interesting, I did meet Geraldine Brooks, and I met her when my book was in copy edits. Actually, it was getting ready to go to copy edits. And Horse had just been published, and she came to Lexington, Kentucky to promote Horse. Our agents, or our editors, actually, her editor was Viking, my editor was with Valentine, all under the Random House, and they arranged for us to be able to get together. And so we had a lunch and we talked about all of this. And it was very interesting because she started, I think, about a year or two before I did, researching Lexington. And we worked for almost 10 years on the same subject without ever knowing of the other one or encountering the other one. And thank God for me that I didn't know that, right? Because if I had heard that Geraldine Brooks was writing about Lexington, I probably would have stopped, But the way that I found out about it was when my agent, when we had the book proposal put together, because then we took the giant manuscript that was like 400 pages long, and we took it and we, put it into a book proposal format, and she sent it to Viking. And Viking said, "Oh, we have one of those already. It's called Horse." And Geraldine Brooks is the author of that. And so that's when I found out about this Horse, and believe me, I thought I was done. I thought I was done at that point. But it went Valentine and some others, so it went at auction, and Valentine acquired it at auction and gave me a chance. And I was grateful for that. And they felt, when Horse came out, and they, of course, had seen mine. I did not read Horse, by the way, until mine was already like through copy edits, because I did not want to be influenced by whatever she wrote in Horse, and or intimidated. And so they did feel that the two books were complementary of each other because there are some things that she was able to do in Horse with the historical fiction that I'm not allowed to do because of the limitations of nonfiction. There's also some things that nonfiction that I can add to the story of Lexington that she was not able or didn't have the room or, didn't fit what she was trying to accomplish, with her fictional account of Lexington. I will tell you that Jarrett, the groom, that is the central figure in Horse, was a real person. But in the nonfiction context, we only know of him in two instances. And one of those is the reference by Charles Trevethan, who's a 19th century historian who writes about this painting by Robert Scott, and he mentions Black Jarrett leading blind Lexington. And so we know this is at Woodburn Farm. There was also in the Woodburn Farm records that I viewed at the Kentucky Historical Society on many occasions, a ledger where Alexander had paid Jarrett. There were payments made to an individual named Jarrett. And so who he called a first-rate groom, by the way, first-rate groom. So that's all we know of Jarrett. But so in my nonfiction context, there's not much I can say, right? But she's able to take that real life person in her Book of Horse and with the research that she did about the history of Black horsemen and be able to tell us and give us an idea of what that must have been like with that character. Not a character, with that real person.
Sometimes I don't pay proper attention. I'm sure there's probably a few other people that do that, but make sure I'm correct. So Lexington was sold in 1850 on Woodburn Farm near. And now who owned the farm? Who owned the farm where Lexington was born?
Woodburn, he was, okay, so he was, where was he foaled?
We sold in 1850.
Yeah, he was foaled in 1850 in Lexington, Kentucky at the Meadows Farm, which is torn down. That was Dr. Elisha Warfield's farm. That was pretty close to where the Association racetrack is, or was and is out in Lexington, Kentucky.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking.
Thank